All right, well, welcome. Tyler here with BroncBuster. We got beautiful Amy.
Hi there.
And we got our buddy Austin here at Brackin Machine. And we're going to talk today about the Bronco steering solutions that we've come up with. And Austin is a big key of this. So I'm gonna just give a really short backstory. These parts and the solutions that we developed were early on in the Bronco. I came up with, after breaking, I think, my third steering rack, through a series of kind of trial and error, came up with what was happening and what needed to happen. And I had a semi-prototype part that I was working with and using that has solved it, but wasn't dialed in perfectly. And that's where I met Austin, right? Austin, I think it was, 3 days before Christmas in 2021 that we met?
Yeah, right about there.
So, Austin, tell us about the bronc bushing. And what is the purpose of this? Because this was the first part that you helped me to fine tune and develop. And what does that do?
Whenever your steering rack is stressed beyond what the slack adjuster was designed to do, it takes up that slack. So there's a small gap in there. And when that rod flexes beyond and starts putting too much pressure on your slack adjuster, that bushing takes over and it distributes that stress across the whole housing rather than putting it all on the slack adjuster.
This is the analogy I like to tell people as I'm sitting there talking this through. It's kind of like the scenario of taking an egg, the egg being the same as that kind of weak aluminum housing, right? And if you took and you put all the pressure of your finger and just hit that egg really hard or pushed in on it, you're going to probably break the egg in that soft shell. Whereas if you were somehow able to take that same amount of pressure and equalize it over the entire egg, that weak eggshell becomes a lot stronger, right?
Yeah, you're just distributing the load and you're kind of transferring it around the perimeter of that housing rather than just putting it in one direction, the slack adjuster taking all of it.
And we have lots of videos. We're not going to go into a lot of detail of that. I mean, if you want to go back and watch some of our early videos when we solved this problem a year and a half ago, there's a lot more description on that. But then the next part of it was I'd met Austin. I knew what his capabilities were. And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, when we broke the steering rack, we also broke the tie rods, the weak little puny tie rods, right? You know, I was sitting there, it was Christmas time. Amy and I we'd taken a trip up to Montana for Christmas. And I'm lying there. I wake up at like 3 a.m. in the morning and I said, I got it. And I had this idea of a part that would clamp over both sides of the inner and the outer tie rod. And I said, all right, I got another thing for Austin because I think Austin can make this happen. And so we came back a couple days after Christmas and we basically camped out at your shop for the next month, right?
Yeah.
We became family. Yeah. We had our crawler hauler and we plugged in power and we were there in the wintertime in Preston, Idaho.
Snowing and everything.
Oh, snowing and blizzard. And I remember we, because at this point I'd already solved this. And actually in December, we had filed for patent application to protect our what we had come up with and starting down that road. Well, then I come to Austin and I said, all right, I got this idea. And I did bring him a tie rod. He starts drawing it up. We start modeling it. And very quickly we have the first model of what would do that. And, it looks different than this because this has been fine tuned, but essentially it is able to clamp over both the inner and the outer part of the tie rod to where now with that clamped on there, the weak part of the tie rod is taken care of. So again, we're sitting there talking about it and I thought, oh, for sure somebody's done this before. And no, nobody had. And so we filed for patent application and that patent has actually issued. Our first patent that we filed for on the bushing is ready to publish here soon. But essentially between those two things at the time, we had solved the steering problems for the Bronco. No failures. And to this day, still never had anybody break a tie rod running the brace and nobody break that side of the housing, right? So those were solved early on. Now, Austin, you were there with us. In fact, this picture in the background with our Cyber Orange Bronco and BroncBuster in the background, and if I move a little bit,
saw that
you can see Amy hanging out on the edge of that cliff, right? So that was the same trip. You were there with us at Moab. And tell us what happened. Why don't you tell that part of the story since you were there with us?
Yeah, you were going up an obstacle. I believe it was top of the world. Is that correct?
Yeah, nothing to it.
Yeah, going up an obstacle. It wasn't a crazy obstacle, and then it broke. The whole housing came apart on the right hand side, and once we got looking at it, it was clear that part of it had been broke for a while, and the crack had just spread, and then that's where it happened to give out. But your steering force motor was hanging there by the wires, and the whole thing was shelled out. And I believe it was Jesse had the same problem on the same day.
That's the funny thing is, I was on top of the world, not very good phone service. I get a phone call. I can't really take the call because of the service, but then I get a text message. Now this was 10 minutes before we shelled mine out. And Jesse's like, hey, I just broke my steering rack. And I'm like, what do you mean you broke your steering rack? And doing this through text, and I'm driving up the obstacles, and he's sending me some pictures. And I'm like, oh, wow. Well, we haven't seen that yet. And 10 minutes later, mine did the exact same thing. Well, we get back to the trailer later that night. Of course, we had somebody bring me a steering rack. Jesse was with Lauren Healy at the time, and Lauren, I think, carries like 5 or 6 steering racks at a time, I think. Anyways, they get on the road again, on the trail again. We have somebody go get mine. We get on the trail again, and we take these 2 broken steering racks. We set them on the trailer, and Austin's mind starts going to work. We start tossing ideas back and forth. And what did we come up with as why it was failing on that side?
We talked about this over, I believe it was some Mexican food, huh? Down in Moab. Well, actually, first we went over and looked at Jesse's to see if it was the same reason for the failure. And we kind of looked at the brakes, and we had determined he had the same issue where his didn't give out all at once. His was broken for a little while. And then the flighting of the ball screw had been rubbing on the housing, making contact. And, that's what was making it split apart like it had. And so yours had the same issue. And that's when we determined that, we had to obviously support that side as well, but you couldn't support it the same way because it wasn't a smooth shaft with, some cut gears on it. It was a ball screw, which is, if you don't know what that is, it just pictures some threads on a big bolt, but the profile is different because there's recirculating balls that run in there. Anyway, so we couldn't do the exact same thing we did on the driver's side, and we had to have a different solution, something to support it.
Yeah. So, I mean, and when I say early on, we're talking May of 2022. So the Bronco hadn't even been out a full year yet. And now we had been to this next thing. Again, we knew that the bushing on the one side, and we knew we needed a bushing on the other side. But in order to get a bushing in there, that's where this pretty piece of billet come into place. And so we come back from Moab, and I don't think Austin slept for 3 days straight, right?
I don't think you slept.
Well, I didn't sleep either, but we sat down again. Amy and I camped out at Austin's machine shop there in Idaho, early May, and we didn't leave until we had a first version of this housing, and again incorporating in a bushing. But this time the bushing was a little bit different material because of that ball screw you talked about, right?
Right. At
that point, we kind of made some modifications to our patent application to include into that bushing both sides and this housing as well. So the reason I bring all this up is, we need to set the record straight. Our competitor out there that has a similar product claiming that he solved the steering issue, and that's just not right. Not at all, even close to.
He was a little late to the game is what he was.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at what they have, it's a direct copy, direct replica of this, right? So 6 months ago, our competitor came out with a video talking about his solution on the steering. And what were some statements that he made?
Yeah, I found those interesting because we discussed them at length at the time, and that was that there was a pretty good campaign explaining why the bushing and the rack on both ends of the rack were a bad idea, why you shouldn't do them. They talked about how they put them on the CMM and, the tolerance that it was out end to end and how it was just a bad idea. You shouldn't do it. And it's just interesting now that the direct knockoff is for sale on their website.
Yeah. I mean, now here we are 6 months later. I mean, yes, they have taken the technology that we've developed and they've incorporated it into a full billet housing, which I want to point that out. All right. You and I talked about back in May of 2022, when we had that housing and we were building that, we talked about rebuilding the entire rack. And what was the conclusion that you and I came to?
The conclusion was that if you had those components on your stock rack, we had no failures, none.
Right.
And to this day, I'm not aware of any failures once those parts were installed. So it was kind of seemed entirely unnecessary.
Right. No, we made the conclusion that if we support both ends of the rack, then there isn't going to be a failure point. And we've proven that because, our competitor has a few that are trickling out into the market now, and they've done some testing, but we have thousands of them out there on vehicles with 100% success rate. So we talk about the tried and true, the tested, and that's what we've done. So, I wanted to point out that number one, they were talking about how these are a bad idea. And now you go on their website, not only are they doing a full billet housing, but they are, in our belief, they are infringing on our patent. We've had these steering solutions out since May. Well, the first one since January of 22, and then the second one, the housing, since May of 22. So with that, we've seen nothing but success in solving the steering problem. And then that allowed us to move on to other things. So I guess right now, the biggest thing we've learned is what happens when people don't use these parts. I get a lot of calls for people that say, hey, I'm stranded in Moab. Do you have a steering rack for us, right? And
we now carry random steering racks.
I do. I've got a whole slew of steering racks. And in addition, we're going to say the Haas 2.0, the stock rack that everybody's Bronco came with, has the next weak point, which is the motor. The motor is only so strong. We start putting these bigger tires and it starts wearing out. So a lot of the calls I'm starting to get now are people that have then taken and worn out their motor. And that's where we now have the Haas 3.0 with all of the parts that we talked about on that as a complete package, now available also on BroncBusterTX.com. So again, if you're looking at any steering solutions, these are the three you come talk to right here, and we can help you with that. We've solved it early on, and we'll continue to come up with the best solutions for you in the Bronco community.